Hello, today I'm doing another genre spotlight video, and in this one I'm going to be talking about young adult literature. So to talk about young adult literature, first we need to talk about the concept of a young adult or a teenager, because that's not something that's always existed throughout history. Now, of course, people always did go through their teenage years. People didn't used to jump from 12 to 18 years old. But the idea of teenager as a distinct phase of life, the idea of adolescence as a time that's distinct from childhood or adulthood, that's something that actually developed in the mid-20th century after World War II. There were a lot of factors that contributed to this, things like changing economy, a shift from an agrarian society to a more industrialized society, compulsory education being extended longer, and the popularization of automobiles. But in any case, a lot of these factors coincided so that in the 1940s, all of a sudden there's this new category of people called teenagers that are not quite children anymore, but are not quite adults yet either. And it was actually around the same time that libraries first became aware of young adults as a category. In fact, the first use of the term young adult to refer to teenagers in libraries did occur in the 1940s. In 1957, the American Library Association created the Young Adult Services Division, which was meant to focus on services for young adults, for teenagers. However, at that time, there were very few books that were written specifically for that age group, and the ones that did exist were not really tailored to the interests or real-life experiences of teenagers at the time. So actually, there was a group of people, but no books that really were meant to appeal specifically to them. More often, teenagers during that time read books that were just intended for adults in general. It was in the late 1960s that the modern young adult genre began to emerge, and one of the earliest examples of this was The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, which was published in 1967. This is often kind of cited as a turning point where the category of young adult became less focused on simple, superficial stories that don't really have any relevance to teenagers, more towards stories that have some level of depth and some level of, addressing issues that teenagers were really dealing with. And that's a trend that continued into the 1970s and 1980s. According to one of the websites that I looked at, there was kind of a decline in young adult fiction in the 1990s, particularly the early 1990s. However, in the late 90s and 2000s, the genre became more popular than ever. One of the big kind of turning points in the history of young adult fiction was the Harry Potter series, which is a little bit odd because Harry Potter is not actually young adult fiction. It's middle grade fiction, meaning that it's meant for older kids who are not yet teenagers. However, it's a series that became more mature and more complex as it went along, and by the end of the series, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and the rest of the main kid characters are in fact teenagers. In fact, some of them are already 18 by the end of the last book. So it makes sense in that way that even though it was sold and marketed as middle grade, the Harry Potter series would have an impact on the young adult genre. For example, as someone who was reading children's fiction around the time that the Harry Potter series began and young adult fiction around the time that it ended, I noticed that there was a huge surge in longer books. Older books for kids and teenagers tended to be very short, and I think publishers and authors tended to assume that kids and teens wouldn't read anything particularly long. Whereas later on, it became very common to see 400, 500, 600-page books marketed towards older kids and teenagers. That was also a time when speculative fiction, meaning science fiction and fantasy, became very popular. And it's sort of the beginning of the trend of adapting young adult novels as movies, which we've seen happen so much over the past few decades. Which brings me to young adult fiction of the early 2000s. In a lot of my genre spotlight videos, I'm speaking more from the research that I've done as opposed to personal experience because, for example, I wasn't there when the Sherlock Holmes novels first became popular or when vampire fiction was invented. But as far as young adult fiction in the early 2000s, I was in middle school and high school during that time, so I can actually speak to what it was like to be a teenager reading it. I remember there being so much paranormal romance, dystopian, and love triangles. Really popular, really successful books of that time were in those categories, like Twilight, for instance, Divergent, Hunger Games. And of course, those are just kind of the big name ones that everybody remembers, but there were so many others that were along similar lines that explored similar concepts or were in similar subgenres. The love triangle was a big thing in stories of that time. Pretty much every book had one, whether it was needed or not. I think that may also be the point where romance became kind of synonymous with young adult, because there really is almost always a romance in young adult fiction. In the 20 teens and what's happened so far of the 2020s, there have been even more changes. One thing that I have noticed is that there seem to be more realistic stories being published now. Things like The Fault in Our Stars, The Hate You Give, or To All the Boys I've Loved Before. Obviously, those are all very different stories from each other, but unlike the stories of the early 2000s, which were primarily speculative fiction, we've moved more towards realistic stories. Not that other types don't still exist and aren't still being published. It's just that there seems to be more of an interest in stories about teenagers in more realistic situations now. There also seems to have been a shift towards darker, more serious, and more mature stories featuring older teens who are maybe 17 or even 18 years old, and situations that are quite a bit more serious than the stories that were told earlier on. And that's true even with the more speculative fiction sort of stories. Like a lot of people, I recently read the Shadow and Bone trilogy and Six of Crows, and I'm looking forward to reading other books in that series because I'm actually really enjoying it. But Six of Crows is definitely not sort of early 2000s young adult where maybe there were serious issues discussed, but there's still, Six of Crows is, the characters are not necessarily what you would describe as good role models. The story itself takes some very dark twists and turns. I would say it's more appropriate for older teenagers, and definitely I can understand why there is some crossover appeal with even for people in their 20s, like myself. I think there's also more recently a move towards more diversity in terms of characters. It's kind of almost a stereotype that the heroine, because it's always a heroine, of a young adult novel is female, white, usually middle class, heterosexual, conventionally attractive but not too pretty, often brunette, and between the ages of 15 and 18 years old. And that last one you can't really change because, yeah, that's the audience that the books are really meant to appeal to. But in terms of some of those other things, you start to see, I think, in works that have been published more recently, a more diverse cast of characters. There are so many different subgenres of young adult literature nowadays as well, usually coinciding with general genres that exist beyond young adult, like, for instance, young adult fantasy, young adult science fiction, romance, mystery, and so on and so forth. And there's often a lot of crossover between those, often with romance playing a significant part, even if it's not the main genre. Basically, I think my biggest takeaway from what I learned about young adult fiction is that in a very short time of just a few decades, really, it's gone from almost non-existent to extremely popular and extremely influential. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it and you would like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe. I post videos on Mondays and Thursdays.